And now I would like to invite our first speaker in this session to give their introductory remarks. And what we've asked these folks particularly to do is to give us some direction as we go into our discussions today and the working sessions of tomorrow. And our first speaker is Gary Bardini. Gary is Deputy Director of the Department of Water Resources. He was appointed in 2011. He oversees over 800 employees and is tasked with the programs that support the California Water Action Plan that I showed a moment ago. And what's very interesting about Gary, as with the case with many of the California agencies, Gary is someone who is a modeler, and a very talented modeler over the years, and he's come up through the ranks. So it's very difficult to catch him out on the technical issues. So, Gary.
Thank you, Peter. Well, that's quite an introduction. Well, good morning, and first of all, I'd like to just pass on Mark's apologies. He was called away to a Senate hearing. Right now we're in May Revise week, and was unable to do it, but I know he was definitely, again, also being a past modeler. I think we still do, I guess we dabble in modeling still at times, trying to figure out the results. But anyway, what I'd like to do is maybe just to put a little perspective, is to put a little context in California water and historically the types of evaluations or model we've done historically over the decades and how I think the trends and where we're going and how things have changed. I'd like to also maybe just talk a little about the state's efforts in water management today and kind of really more what kind of activities, which are the questions we're answering. And then lastly, maybe give you some thoughts as a past modeler, what I think are some of the challenges and where I think we need to go as a community. Before I do that, sometimes I give speeches at times, and I kind of first of all just set a setting, and I thought maybe it's appropriate today, is about California as a whole and its legacy over the last 2 centuries. The fact is that California lives in an aspect of extremes in rain events, and then of course long periods of dryness like the one we're in today is a drought. And because with that extreme, there's been an aspect of every decade over those centuries as an aspect to address that or to manage it to the best in which the community at time has done, which has led to some of the aspects of some of the most significant infrastructure unbridled towards managing that. But on the other end, there's the aspects of how do we manage that to what I think are the objectives and goals in today. But it's very important to just kind of put that perspective, and it affects all parts of the state in the same way. At the end of the day, this management of the extremes is I would say, is consistent across the state, and then the state basically has a different set of hydrologies that is kind of unique to itself in the extreme events. In some cases, I say, you know, we end up with 2 major events. We're in a dry year. If we end up with 8 major events that we can capture, we actually are in a wet year. And that's essentially what we actually are managing in general. And with that, we're trying to maintain essentially some aspects of what we call sustainability, managing the societal and the environmental and the economics that the water basically touches. But before I go in there, I was having to do an interview, and I actually did this actually at Delta Stewardship Council, which was an interview probably about a month ago from one of the media outlets, and essentially went on for quite a bit. And finally, it was in water management question. They tried to give me the old zinger question, so are you happy where we're at? And I had to reply back and I go, well, I don't think anybody in the industry is happy where we're at, but are we better today than we were 10 years ago? Well, my daughter happened to see that interview, who's back from college, and she saw the interview. She goes, well, the appropriate answer is you should have said, I'm not physically capable of being happy. And yeah, so I'm going to take her everywhere with me from now on. But in some ways, it's kind of a true statement, because the fact is, I think folks in the room, and I've been in the business for over 30 years, and you look at it and I see a lot of faces, and we've been hard at it, and I don't think anybody says we're happy where we're at. We continue to press and innovate. The development of the state's infrastructure over that period to deal with water resource management has been an effort by folks in multiple generations, and I see folks in this room that are also of that, and it's that commitment and that aspect of never being happy and how do we do it better. And I think this conference reflects that commitment and the ability, can we do it better? We've been answering questions in the past and doing studies, but how do we do it better and make it more relevant to the day? So with that, let me talk about what I think is just some of the evolutions of the questions and where we're at. When I actually started in the 80s and and prior to the 80s, I think a lot of it was what we call was heavy in the development period. And it was actually, but it's amazing that how much of that infrastructure was based on a limited aspect of historical event. 28, 30, or 34 was kind of the big drought of record that we were kind of basing it on. And then really the 55 flood was kind of the big one in the Central Valley. And pretty much all the things were kind of based on that. And so we did our best to manage around that. And I would call that kind of the early years. But as we got into the 80s, then we had a number of things. We had a 77 drought, we had an 86 flood, all of a sudden we started looking, and then we started dealing with the resource issue. We started with D1485, and we started having the state board hearings, and it's just a number of things that are developing in the 80s. But I still call that the era of trying to get to what I call some sort of economic certainty was the issue. I think that was the mindset of the day. And then it was in the 90s where we started really recognizing the resource issues and how do we manage that. And there was a number of events from CVPIA and BIOPS, and then we had the Accord and D14. 1641, and then we had essentially the CalFed programmatic EIR, which Mark and I and others in this room worked on. And then we actually saw the beginning of water bonds being used to help the efforts, and we saw that with Prop 204. So these are just some of the evolutionary things that was the beginning. And of course, temperature control and estuary modeling was the bigger issues, and we started moving in those kind of questions. In the aughts, it's kind of interesting. What I saw is that climate uncertainty became a much bigger understanding, that the fact of what the past is in the future isn't indicative. And so we've gone much further in global climate modeling. We've gone further to look at uncertainty more in the aspects of how we do resource management. And of course, there was more events. We had, again, more dry events this time. We had a Katrina, which really highlighted the issues. And then, of course, we had a number of efforts in legislation. We had, obviously, we talked about the 2009 legislation that has led to the co-equal, but more importantly, there was aspects of 2007 legislation for flood management. There was an aspect of essentially a considerable amount of bond funds to help address this in Prop 84, Prop 50, Prop 30, Prop 1E. And these things drove a lot of what was happening and what was resourcing and doing water management. Today, in the it's called the teens and where we're at, I think today the issue, and we saw this in the Governor's Action Plan, I think we're trying to say we need to basically be able to reflect this towards sustainability. And I know the definition of that varies, but getting clear on that. But generally that sustainability will evolve around a societal and environmental and economic, and how do we balance that? We see that today in the drought, and more we're looking towards getting to sustainability and defining that. And so today it's interesting, and I can say over the last, I would say last 2 years, significantly since we laid out the Governor's Action Plan, we've seen the aspects of groundwater legislation, countless drought legislations and executive orders. Proposition 1 was passed. We now see a reshaping of the water fix and eco-restore now to refocus. We continue to press out in our earworm efforts and planning at the regional level. And of course, we had the Central Valley Flood Plan in 2012. A number of things are moving further, but it's all towards, I think, more to that sustainability and reflects that. So let's talk about states' efforts. States' efforts, I talked about the Governor's Action Plan and the other legislation, but I want to frame it very simply into 5 major areas. The first one, as I like to talk about, is really dealing with essentially Action 1, water conservation as a way of life, how we handle the drought, and then how do we help our operational efficiencies. A lot of that, I think, goes around residual risk management, heavily towards the activities around that, and you're asking questions related to that in real time. The second part is how do we handle regional management better? Action 2 reflects that. How do we get to more regional sustainability or resiliency, but you also have the aspects of how do we handle storage, and particularly groundwater management has been heavy, and more importantly, the water quality issues and the health issues related to safe drinking water. So those would be action items 2, 6, and 7. The next one is how do we handle our river and our flood and our watersheds, and how do we basically bring them together, both the actions 4 in terms of restoration, actions 8 related to flood, very closely relate to essentially how do we do better river management as a whole and watershed management, how do we basically integrate those in a better way. And then the one that we've talked about then is action 3, which is the co-equal and the aspects of system storage. And of course, Prop 1 provides additional incentive funding to go further in that and we're seeing the aspects of how do we continue to deal with the conveyance issues in the Delta and a lot of the things that are focused in the charge that a lot of folks in this room here to continue to answer those questions. But I think the thorniest one of it and the most difficult of it is Action 10. Action 10 is about how do we finance this? And more importantly, how do we measure progress of all the activities I just described to the public? And how do we measure it? These are the questions that folks in the room here are responsible or do a lot to help provide. when we make these investments, we do these things, what are we getting the value? And this is the questions that I more importantly get more and more. Over the last decade that I've been spending time in the legislature and as Mark is there again today, the aspects more going, what is the value of the activities and the management action we're doing, and what are we getting against really that measure of sustainability, and how are we measuring that? And more importantly then, how do we prioritize our financing to that? And we saw that with the financing of Prop 1, again, which was very much hung more underneath now a plan, which was the governor's action plan, and we framed tremendously with the administration the financing based on that. So I think that's kind of where we're at today in California water. I wanted to put a little perspective historical, but let me give you a few of my takeaways that I think are kind of important to think about. One is as an old modeler, and I got this from David Ford many years ago, who were doing work, and one time we get into a project, and the first thing you have to ask your question is, what question are you answering before we discuss what data or models or tools? And I would have to basically really remind folks to always remember what is the question we're trying to answer. And it takes a bit of disciplining to do that, but always remember, or as I like to say, always have the end in mind. So what product, what do we see, how do we think we're going to frame it? We need to be clear on that before we start initiating the actual technical work and the analysis. I want to give you maybe a couple examples of where I think today, where I see where the end game in mind and what I think. The aspects of how we handle stream flow accretions and pollutions right now, we're seeing this in the drought, it's becoming very critical. And if we had better tools in real time and information and data, I think it would greatly assist in the management of the drought. And I think right now, I think as the future goes on, we'll have to as a community do a lot better in bringing that context together. And how does that affect in the environment as we have these changes? But right now, better real-time tools that can handle the accretion depletions in the system is very important. The legislation a little bit will have an opportunity with the groundwater well. I think we'll go further to press that. The second one, which I think is another one, is more and more is what's our water budget and balance in the long term, and what does sustainability look like? And I don't mean sustainability just in aspect of economic certainty or the aspects of providing for a local, but really what does it look for a regional area in a sustainable way across those boundaries I talked about? And how do we do that is the balance that ultimately is led. And so right now we're going to have to go much further in evaluations of that with essentially with the SGMA legislation now passed. And I think it's going to be a good step for us statewide to do this. Third thing I always say is when we're doing the modeling and we do the analysis, answer the question, but acknowledge the uncertainty. But I'd like to be clear, it's never perfect. We have to state our assumptions. What are the limitations of our data and models? We need to move and post-process as best we can for understanding to the different audiences you have. But I really say at the end of the day, we need to answer the question. As I say at times across my organization, I go, it's more important to get the information out at the right timing than it is to say I got a little bit better down the future when the moment has passed to answer the question. So I'd say please answer the question. And then lastly, whose questions are you answering? Some cases, the folks in the room, a lot of times we do, and I think this is foundational, is we do the aspects of answering questions in here about how do we move information, data, best models, how do we handle it. That's very much within the technical group, one that I've actually, enjoyed my career in and really been very lucky to be grounded in those foundations. But at the end of the day, I have to move that at the highest level to some aspect of overall performance measure towards that sustainability of the societal, environmental, and economics. And that's what the public is interested in, or the legislature, the folks. So we have to translate from the details and the data exchange and managements and all the technical stuff in here and translate it eventually to essentially a sustainable metric that we can actually talk. But more importantly, at the end of the day is, and there's folks here at the table, is we have to move towards essentially how do we inform you what I think are the high-level management decisions that need to be made. And so one thing is while we have to basically garnish the continued support of the public, maintain a very strong network among the technical community and academics and agencies to carrying out this work. But at the end of the day, we need to be able to translate this information from there up and distill it down through the agencies up to the policymakers that need to be made up. And how do we do that is essential to the group here, and I would say is probably the most thorniest. Last thing, I just had to leave you with my points. I say this a lot. One of the things I always say is we need to move out from essentially what I call our silos or stovepipes or the words we have. We always do this and always move essentially to a better collaboration, to cooperation, and eventually commitment, which is what you really ultimately need. And I would say today is for a group here, we need to be committed to take risks, to continue to press and innovate, which has been done the legacy of the state over the last 200 years. and continue to press that legacy in here. So take the risks, and I think it's going to require us to basically, as a group, to really, really, really cooperate more, and eventually, I think, commitment to actually address the issues that I just described. So with that, thank you very much.
can work it out, or you can give me your laptop and put it in. And I have a flash right here.
Start. Hello? Let's all reassemble. We'll want to get started. So we finish in time for lunch. We will either break for lunch or break down for lunch. That's how these things work. Okay, so can somebody go out and embarrass the people in the hallway and make them come back in here? That's the only way things really get restarted on these things. I apologize for speaking too long in the last session. That's why we're running about 15 minutes later. So I'm going to try to make up 10 minutes on this session so that you get in time for lunch. We have 5 speakers between now and in the next hour and a half. And they're quite international. We have a speaker from Australia, Hong Kong, the Netherlands, England, Australia, and UC Davis, and Johns Hopkins. So we have East Coast, West Coast of this continent, and 3 other continents, all around the subject of integrated environmental modeling. And I'm going to let each of the speakers introduce themselves, because I don't want to take any time from them. And here we go.
Thanks, Jay.
Here's John Argent.
Robert Argent. Okay, good morning. And it is morning. It's about 3:30 for those that follow international timelines. So today I'm giving a slightly broader perspective than you may have seen earlier this morning. I'm speaking from the position of a national agency, a national operational agency, that delivers environmental intelligence. And this is about taking integrated environmental modelling, but actually going the full breadth of delivery from observations through to decisions. And I'll just get my speaker's notes, because otherwise it'll be a very short talk. The little disc in the corner there just gives you the, in very fine writing that you can't read, the breadth of the work that the Bureau of Meteorology in Australia actually covers. So we're Australia's national meteorological, ocean, atmospheric, hydrological, volcanic ash and tsunami service. We're fairly busy sometimes. So I'm offering you that perspective, but the paper that have been circulated to hopefully all of you on conceptual modelling also gives you a little bit of background to my work in this area. So prior to coming to the Bureau of Meteorology, I worked in the University of Melbourne in the academic sector, and so I'm bringing, I guess, a combination of perspectives there. The academic ideas around conceptual modelling and the application of conceptual modelling and integrated modelling, and then the delivery aspect through the concept of environmental intelligence. So for our agency, environmental intelligence is really about these conclusions drawn from models and observations combined, so integrated, to guide decisions and actions. And we're talking about governments, businesses and individuals here. And our four key goals in our mission statement are looking out for public safety, environmental sustainability, societal well-being and economic prosperity. So some very clear objectives of the end point of our environmental intelligence. So coming from integrated environmental modelling to environmental intelligence. So integrated environmental modelling, a lot of the topics you sort of heard talked about in the early session this morning were about bringing together models from different physical domains, the ecological elements, the social elements and the economic elements, and bringing those together. Now, in our context, moving from integrated environmental modelling to environmental intelligence, we really look at the full spectrum from our Earth observing approach through modelling, through forecasting to the information and warning services. So it's a full, I guess, spectrum, taking the models and actually putting them into use. And a lot of what the speakers this morning talked about were very much about getting that last link, actually getting your models, the outputs from models, used to inform the day-to-day decisions, used to inform policy, used to inform investment. So that's the spread or the scope that I'm considering today. So just some elements of good modelling practice across that spectrum. And I'm looking at this in the process of coming from a research environment through actually taking the models that we develop in the research area through to the actual application and use on a day-to-day basis or a continual basis. And so some of the sorts of, excuse me, some of the sorts of practices that I'm sure we'll hear quite a lot about over the coming 2 days are taking a partnership approach in modelling, having very clear and agreed priorities, responsibilities and roles. It's often a little bit challenging and dangerous when you're looking at integrated modelling. People are coming along with their model and they're saying, well, this is the priority, this is where we should be looking, etc., rather than agreeing at a higher level what those priorities are, what the responsibilities of people working on them are, and what the roles are. Some fundamentals about good coding practice. So the requirement of going from a research model to an actual operational model used in decisions on an ongoing basis starts right back at the fundamental coding side of things. So good planning, good coverage of your tests and good version control. So just knowing where you are and where you've come from in the modelling development side of things. It is, I guess, an ultimate goal to create models that are elegant and robust. So that is that they are simple enough to be usable, but complex enough to be useful. And that's, we could spend, I have spent many conferences with some of the people in this room here, discussing actually the whole modelling practice and where is the line between models that are actually usable, can be put into action, can inform decisions, but have enough in them to be useful, but not too much. So there's a very fruitful area for discussion there over the next couple of days as well. And then when you are integrating models from different domains, so as an example, some of the physical processes in the diagram there, also having clearly defined interfaces between models and having adopted standards for exchanging information, exchanging data between models. Then, of course, having actually developed these models in research, we'd like to put them in operations. Now, in an agency such as ours or NOAA, National Weather Service, USGS, those sorts of things that run 24/7 operations, there's a clear understanding that research models are not operational models. They're far from it. Even Jay in the last presentation was talking about getting to the decision, putting a third the effort or possibly even 10 times the effort that you put in research, actually transitioning this into the operational environment, into the decision-making environment. So some of the challenges that you have in this area are actually integrating this with other systems, with upstream and downstream. Now, that can be upstream and downstream data systems, upstream and downstream policy, so coming on the input end to the models. What policies are you trying to reflect as your input to the models? How are you interpreting the output from those models actually in terms of the policy you're trying to inform? So very much being aware of where your model that you're trying to implement actually sits within that full end-to-end spectrum. Transitioning, having staged and controlled transition processes into operations, and a classic in some organisations, and I suspect there'll be some people in the room for whom this is familiar, this thing of fence tossing. I'm a researcher, I've done my model, someone's finding it useful, that's interesting, here you go and deal with it, I'm on to the next interesting thing. Now the person over here who's trying to deal with it is going, hang on, how's this work? So-and-so's not here, they don't know, they're the ones who know how to hook it up to this data source. Well, they're off doing something else. So that's where the idea, the concept of early life support, having your researcher actually available and involved in trying to use the model in the decision, because it's the model of the developer who actually knows about the foibles of their brand new model baby. And then testing all the time. And then when you're actually in practice, have your model actually being used to provide a service, to provide products to people, to inform decisions about weather or agriculture or anything like that. Really focusing on end users and end users. And look, I won't be the first and I'll be far from the last person to say that you need to be very sure, very clear about understanding what use is being made of the outputs from here. So that's understanding in the operational context the mandate of those who are using the outputs from your models. What outcomes are sought? And in this case, I'm using the policy meaning of outcome. That is a positive impact on a community. What is the impact you're trying to achieve, not what is the output from the model that you're after. What's the actual impact on the community that you're after? What are the priorities then for those organisations that are involved? What resources are available? Often you'll hear people complain that I can't achieve what I'm after, I don't have enough resources. Give me more resources and it will all be solved. That's approaching things from the wrong end. I'm sure Bill hears that from time to time. Just give me more and I'll solve all your problems. But really understanding, coming back from what outcomes you're trying to achieve, what outputs do you need, and therefore what can you do with the inputs that you have, the resources that you have available to do that, and then having that being informed by policies. Testing and verification, so actually the feedback, closing the loop. Going through an adaptive cycle. So as we apply models, make decisions and see the outcomes, taking those observations and bringing them back in to the other end of the process. And then within that, having that clear loop back into research and development. So to give you an example of where this information is coming from, so here's a few snapshot of some of the sorts of things that my bureau does. So we run Australia's most, I think we're in the top 10 of Australia's most popular websites, billions of hits each year. We produce over 400,000 forecast products each year, over 15,000 warnings and watches for hazardous weather or ocean conditions. We work across the domains of, as I said, weather, climate, space weather, oceans and marine water and hydrology. We forecast cyclones, we do tsunami warnings, volcanic ash, and goes on and on and on and on and on. So you can imagine for an agency that does that with a staff of about 1,500 people nationally, we have a very clear understanding of how integrated modelling must work in the decision-making context. And I'll just run through a couple of our domains that are relevant to where we are today, but also to some of the drought situation within which we're finding ourselves. I was thinking just before that we have the term drought, which implies to people an unusual set of circumstances. So a set of circumstances that are not the norm or not the average or something. What we haven't found is a term to describe the change of circumstances from what living memory tells us, but which we have to live with into the future. Because drought often implies to people, this is an unusual thing, we're going to go back to something else from living memory. Now, we will be moving back and forwards, but I was thinking if we could come up with a term that implied, no, it's a change from what we have known in the past and what our parents have known in the past. Not permanent, but definitely something that is it's no temporary thing. So drought, a term that doesn't imply that the sort of temporariness of drought, but that's a bit of an aside. So in Australia, the Bureau of Meteorology was given a national role in water information in around 2007. At that point, we were probably 8 to 10 years into a national drought, what we call our millennium drought. And again, we still use that term drought because we look back at it now. We had 2 wet years after the end of that. Everyone said, oh, that's it, the drought's over. But unfortunately, we didn't go back to normal conditions. And although, thank goodness, a lot of what we have done as a national agency and as a nation coming out of that millennium drought live on with us about our changes to water management practices and water use practices. So some of the sorts of products that we've developed in the last 7 years cover everything from streamflow forecasting, coverage of how much water is in the National Water Bank, looking at desalination and other climate resilient water sources, undertaking an operational daily run national water balance on a 5-kilometre grid. I must admit, Jay, I thought you were being possibly a bit of a reach, bit of a stretch when you were claiming that standardisation of units was a success for North America. So we might discuss that one. We might discuss that one. So I'll stick to SI through all my discussions. Streamflow groundwater, water markets. So certainly we've had over quite a number of years now of operating a national water market, trading in entitlements to water, trading in water allocation. So just briefly running through a few examples of that. We now have an operational short-term, this is in addition to flood forecasting, which has been a long-term role for the Bureau. We now have an operational short-term streamflow forecasting that gives you out to 7 days. This is for sort of water managers, but also even the kayakers and anyone who's really interested in river flows can get access to now a daily updated 7-day forecast of stream flow. It's really targeted at river and storage operation. And it does also, and this is a model used certainly in the UK and I think a little bit here, gives a heads up, a warning for our flood forecasters. We essentially have a flying squad of flood forecasters. We have some outsourced in our state capitals, but a core of people in head office. And when we get this sort of 7-day heads up that there's going to be some flood warning work, they pack their bags, they get on the plane, and they go up there, and they're ready to go. So that's gives our flying squad also a heads up. And this is a system that's developing. And again, all of these I could talk all day. You'd be very bored. But this is a system that's up and running now, and it will be public next month. Seasonal streamflow forecasting, this is something we've been doing for a couple of years now, based on our 25-year operational climate seasonal outlook, so a 3-month climate outlook. And this looks at a probabilistic approach to stream flows out to 3 months. We're extending that out to 6 months, or trying to extend that out to 6 months now. And we're heading up, looking up to about 100 locations in the next 15 months on that. We monitor daily over 97% of the water held in public water supply in the country. So we get daily input data from all the major storages, 310 major storages across the country, that allows you to look on a daily basis how full, how much water have we actually got, and how's it compared to last year. Also desalination and recycling, so tracking the daily water production of nearly 600 facilities across the country. So how's our water factories, how are they going? And then, as I mentioned, an operational continental scale daily water balance model. So this gives you on a gridded basis things like your rainfall, soil moisture and other water balance elements. We have also, and I was talking to some of the attendees last night at a little reception that was held, about a new climate outlook service. So we've been running for 25 years a 3-month ahead seasonal outlook of climate. We actually went back about a year or two ago and started to talk to some of the users about how they were using this probabilistic information. And we found they were actually misunderstanding the way that we were communicating uncertainty or certainty in our forecasts. And so we've actually done a significant overhaul of this service to make sure that all the science actually hits the ground in terms of the decision. It's very a dangerous thing to go and talk to the users to say, how did you use my information? They said, oh, well, I did this way, and I did this, and this is the decision I made. And you sort of run and hide, because it's like, no, that's not how you should be using that uncertainty information. So we've had a significant increase in our understanding of how people use our data in decision making. So where are we going? Some of the future services as well. Enhancing our drought information service. So this is a very hot topic. I mean, it's a very hot topic here. It's a very hot topic in Australia as well, no pun intended. That what we're doing is there's a lot of money in drought. Drought assistance services are a very so this is essentially drought payments for farmers. We're the national agency that sort of draws the boundary for the states, that says, this bit's had this much rainfall deficit and this one's had this much rainfall deficit, and they get more money than them. Now you can imagine how upsetting that is if you're a farmer and you actually happen to be just on that side of the line that gets money rather than on that side. So you'd actually like to argue that, no, the boundary should be around there. So we have a significant role in bringing together our data sources to provide the best possible current state information on rainfall deficit, but also looking into using our forecasting the actual break of drought as well. Again, using that term drought, that's a loaded term. So yeah, there's a few examples of the kind of areas that we're looking at, and taking a probabilistic approach to what might happen in the future towards drought break. And then I think probably my final point, the other thing is multi-week forecasts. One of the large gaps that occurs in the forecasting, in the water forecasting side of things and climate forecasting, is that we do that forecast out to 7, maybe out to 10 days if you're feeling good. And then we do a monthly forecast and a 2 and a 3 month forecast, getting out to a 9-month forecast in some situations. But really bridging that gap for a lot of decision makers, it's that kind of 7, 10 to 14 to 21 day forecast that is really essential to some of the, particularly in things like agricultural industries at certain times of year. That's a significant area for informing decisions and informing better decisions. So that's another area that we're looking at informing. And things like the example there, this January 24 heatwave, this was early onset dryness. So giving a farmer a heads up that in the next 4 weeks or next 3 weeks, you're going to see there's a significant hot spell and your soil moisture is going to disappear. And So giving people a heads up on that is the sort of service that we're looking at. So there's just a small snapshot of some of the ways that we use models, that develop our models and then put them into use to assist decision making. And I look forward to today, the rest of today and tomorrow, to be more involved in this and to hopefully give you a little bit more of my experience as well. Thank you.
Let's make time for one question.
No, don't even need that. All right.
Wow, such a clear talk. Here we go.
So you have this black box that takes data in and sends information out. I'd be interested to know what the flux in and out is.
Yeah.
How much data goes in and how much information goes out on a daily basis.
Sure. We thanks for that. We actually have more than one black box. We have many of them, and there are many individuals that we think of as our point sources of failure in those models. But we literally take in millions of observations a day. So our data assimilation systems are probably as large and complex as actual modelling systems. So on the input side of things, millions of atmospheric, land and ocean observations come flowing in, remotely sensed. We get, obviously quite a large reliance on remotely sensed data. Because one of the important things if you're using modelling in an operational sense is that the better you can get your current state as an input to the model, obviously the better your model forecast can be. So that's on the input end. And similarly, so as I said, on the output end, for example, over 400,000 forecasts a year. So the sorts of things we put out, we're talking the order of thousands of outputs each day through the various media and various channels that we put out our information. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
Joseph? Yeah. We'll have Joseph Lee from Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. He'll introduce himself. If I can find his, do you have a talk here?
I think so. I mean, just it's on the, I think it's just.
Is it one of these here?
It's a folder. It's a, no, it's a, I think we should get some help, actually.
Let's try and go here.
Yeah, maybe. No, it's,
They said that they opened up a whole.
yeah, but I think the, so. This one.
In the session? In the session?
This one, session.
Click on it. No. Excuse me. Okay.
Yeah, sure. I think it's, there's your folder. And it's a workshop presents.
This it?
Yeah, this one, and then just go to this one. Okay, just blow it up. Okay, colleagues, so I have 20 minutes, right? 15, okay. So what I'd like to do is to just share some experience of a system we've developed 5 years ago called Water Management System, and it is a real-time water quality forecast and management system for the smart green cities of tomorrow. So my background is in environmental hydraulics and water quality modeling, and I've been working at this for the past 35 years or so. And originally, I wanted to say just what this system is about. It provides daily beach water quality forecasts. It actually provides red tide forecasts as well, challenging as it may seem. And it's used in fisheries management. Now, the background of this is actually in the 80s when we were watching the ocean and wonder why sometimes these fish kills occur and sometimes they don't under apparently the same conditions. And we thought there must be a way of doing better in at least interpreting the data. Very often when an environmental disaster occurs, you don't know what really doesn't have a clue of what's happening, even interpreting the data. And very often socially, it's a very shocking event, very often environmental disasters. So when we started, this is not about an agency, it's just about maybe 20, 30 researchers working closely with the government, different government departments to produce a system that we believe actually works and actually produces benefits for society. So in this system, we call Waterman, there's a beach water quality forecasting system, there's a fisheries management and red tide forecast system, and embedded within it is actually a 3D EIA system, which kind of is the core engine of it all. And the project is supported by the Hong Kong Jockey Club, about 30 million Hong Kong dollar sum, and it's developed since about 2008, and it's still ongoing now, supported by different funds. And it's a collaboration between engineers, biologists, and computer scientists. And I think the most important thing is it has the deep collaboration of government departments, namely the Agriculture and Fisheries Department, the Drainage Services Department, the EPD, Environmental Protection Department, the Observatory, and then the Leisure and Cultural Services Department. So it is because you need the data, you need the interpretation, and so on. So I'll just highlight maybe at the outset some of the unique features in Asia. I think other than the, of course, population growth and urbanization increases the vulnerability of coastal cities. But aside from the technical aspects, which you all know, I think one or two characteristics of Asian megacities is that usually you find pollution sources very close to the sensitive receivers. And that poses particular technical challenges for models because your model has to work on a multi-scale domain in order to induce the kind of credibility and confidence by the users and the society at large. And secondly is water quality data, as much as we would like to think otherwise, are typically actually very sparse and costly. Unlike big data, the syndrome, the kind of phenomenon we are. And I think of E. coli data, bacteria data. We would like genomics would one day solve the problem of not having to wait 24 hours, 48 hours. But today, as I know it, it's still not on. I mean, it's still typically water quality data is sparse and costly. So just very quickly, Hong Kong is a special administrative region of China, about 7 million population, sitting at the edge of the Pearl River Estuary, a partially mixed estuary, and next to the largest manufacturing base in the world, and is actually not a drought area. It's about 2,000 millimeter annual rainfall, and Hong Kong, as many of you would know, is a very compact megacity, if you like, very small place, 1,000 square kilometers, but within this stretch of about 1,800 square kilometers of coastal waters, actually, there's a lot of things happening. And we are bound by very, very rigorous EIA regulations, and hence the need for quantitative environmental management. Now, I'd like to talk about two systems, not so much the technical details, but how we actually use it, actually. So one is what interested us. Well, beaches, we have 41 gazetted beaches with lifesavers, lifeguards. And every year we have 10 million visitors, 41 beaches. And that's a very important resource to us, natural resource. Those of you who think of Hong Kong as shopping paradise, but it's really a lot of it's a quality of life for the average citizen is actually pretty good. You don't have to spend a lot of money just visiting these beaches. And based on epidemiological studies, we kind of grade our beaches according to E. coli. Okay, you can debate on whether it's reasonable, but as of this moment, we still rest based on E. coli. And we have 4 beach gradings depending on the concentration of E. coli, which you can sample on any given day on a beach. And it's good, fair, poor, very poor. So good is less than 24 counts per 100 milliliter, and very poor is above 610. And if you get a very poor grading several times in a row, according to the law, you can close the beaches. Okay, so it's sampled roughly on weekly, during the bathing season, weekly intervals, and based on these data, you make your decisions. And even at this moment, it's purely based on past data, the geometric mean of the past 5 samplings. So it doesn't have any forecast ability. Now, the other, when we think of a water quality or management and integrated environmental management for megacity, coastal megacity like Hong Kong, in Hong Kong in particular, it's very influenced by major sewage strategy, major sewage treatment schemes. And in Hong Kong, the sewage of a population of 3 million, it goes through this, what we call a harbor area treatment scheme, which is essentially goes through deep tunnels and then centrally collected in a treatment plant which provides chemically assisted, chemically enhanced primary treatment. So it's 3 million people, okay, 1.8 million cubic meter per day of sewage coming out. And and we've provided disinfection because without disinfection, you are not going to protect the beaches since March 2010, about 4 years ago. So essentially, we provide advanced primary treatment. It removes a good portion of the organic suspended solids and so on, a little bit of the nutrients. And about only 50% of the E. coli, as you know, this kind of treatment is not very effective in removing the bacteria. But we started to provide disinfection, which takes it down by 2 orders of magnitude about 3 or 4 years ago. The point I want to make here is that in megacities like Hong Kong, I mean, these are beaches. You know, the beaches are very close to discharges. I don't have a pointer here, but you see I just use the, I hope the cursor is, you see this HETS L4, this L4 is really the treated sewage of a population of 3 million will come out into the harbor and in very close proximity to beaches. And there are multiple uses, not just recreation. You have fish culture zones, mariculture, you have flushing water intakes, you have monitoring stations, etc. So I'm just trying to, so you have these beaches, you have fish culture zones, you have flushing water intakes, you have what we call secondary water contact areas, and we have a lot of monitoring stations. So normally in Asian cities, you have a lot of multiple uses for in a very, very compact environment, and that's why you need a, so in a way, if you think of an environment like this, you have all the non-point source, point source going in, I would say all as shear flows, as buoyant shear flows, jets of all kinds. And then it's, it can be dense jets, it can be sediment jets, it can be, and it is a multi-scale problem, ranging from the order of minutes when it comes to surface or is trapped in a certain layer, to hours or length scale of tens of kilometers before it reaches a beach. And so it's really actually a multi-scale problem. And the way we do it with forecast system like this is really we have to use a subgrid scale model rather than CFD in the near field, and coupled with a special dynamic coupling method with just a standard shallow water circulation code and with, if needed, particle tracking. So the idea of our system is something like this. So for beach water forecasting, we use a combination of data-driven models, which is derived based on a lot of research on physically based hydrological models and hydrodynamic models, field studies and laboratory studies on E. coli decay, etc., as well as deterministic models and past data. So in a way, you try to data assimilate and predict the beach water quality on every day, 11 o'clock, and then we're not aiming at the exact number, but rather at the beach grading, which is what the legal standard is. Now this is all, and through a lot of analysis, these are the main factors from solar radiation to rainfall to tide level, etc., salinity, and every beach is different. Every beach has its own model, whether it's neural network or multiple linear square. But for certain types of models, you have to go to 3D deterministic model because the environmental conditions just change. In many cities, it just change over time. And this is an example where it's very complicated terrain, where you have the the major sources very close to the beaches, very complex, and then every beaches, you have all these beaches next to the urban environment, and so, for example, you introduce disinfection, it will change the entire landscape, and you cannot use data-driven models. And for those, we have to use deterministic models. And this is, for details, you can refer to the paper, but this is the whole grid for the Pearl River Delta. We have our own way of dynamic coupling, which we call a distributed entrainment sink approach. So we have a model we call JACLAG, a robust Lagrangian model, and we have a way of coupling at grid cell level, at grid cell level. So to do this, this kind of, and giving you data kind of forecast for every day. So I just want to, but basically we've used, this is actually put to use. We found use of this kind of system in many ways. Namely, definition of mixing zones. We spent many years just trying to grapple how to define a mixing zone. Daily beach water forecasts, setting of standards, emergency response, and also optimal disinfection dosage control, because it turns out in our setting, it's very much related to the tide. And so every day for the past 4 years, we've been providing this beach grading forecast with an accuracy of, depending on the district, ranging from very high success to around 70% success. So this has been validated against extensive data and extensive research. So this is the first thing. Now, if I could just spend 3 minutes and just talk about the other, which we take pride in, a value of the system is in fisheries management. Through this, we are able to define the carrying capacity of 26 fish culture zones in Hong Kong. So namely, how much fish can it take in what season? And we also have a red tide early warning system. And so it's based on dissolved oxygen, nitrogen, chlorophyll, and these parameters which we are. So this is an example where we say for 26 of these fish culture zones, in tons of fish, how much fish can these zones take? And whether it's overcapacity, undercapacity, identification of new zones. And this is one of the things we do, which enables you a rational basis to issue new licenses or expansion of overloaded zones by doing something, etc. So this is one thing. Now, the thing we take most pride in is actually the red tide forecasting, which we went away from fully 3D integrated models in this case. Rather, we rely on insights derived from 3D models. And so to us, to be able to forecast the likelihood of a red tide in Hong Kong, there are only two factors that counts. One is what we call a stability risk factor, which if you can simulate tides and stratification, you can produce that. We have a framework to do that. The other is nutrient threshold. And based on these and based on existing data, we can forecast the threshold, the risk, the likelihood of a bloom risk occurring, okay? And this is just, let's say, for example, of a likelihood event that actually occurred at the border near Shenzhen. So this is to just wrap up the conclusions. So from where we stand, we don't represent any agency, but we work very closely with departments, government departments. The integrated hydrodynamic and water quality forecast systems can be very useful for environmental management. And our system has been developed based on extensive validation against field data. And we believe it captures the daily water quality variations much more accurately and reliably than the current system, which would provide better protection to public health. Now, whether it has been adopted, I can report that the system has, well, you saw at the outset there are several government departments, but the degrees of adoption is entirely different for different reasons. One is there's a natural resistance to innovation, institutional resistance to innovation, but in this case, it has been positively adopted by the Drainage Services Department and the AFCD. So I think it has its successes, and we'll talk about some of the not so successes. Thank you.
Hopefully we'll find some time to bring your questions to Professor Lee over lunch, And with that, we'll move on to the next speaker, Carol Heinert from Deltares.
Good morning. Oh, almost a flood here. Good morning. My name is Karel Heinert. I work for Deltares. Deltares is a, you can call it, Dutch water institute. We have about 800 people. Many of them do environmental modeling, and actually I'm not one of them, but I'm still going to talk to you. I hope it doesn't disappoint you. So I will talk a bit more about how to use these kind of systems. And I called my presentation, I thought, Delta thinking, which is a bit ambitious. But in the Netherlands, there's this interesting phenomena. After we had big floods in the 50s, of the last century, there was this Delta program, a very technical program, where we built these big barriers, which we are proud of, and we show to everybody. But after that, this program changed into, let's say, got an environmental touch. There were open barriers, and there was communication between the civil engineers and the ecologists and the socio-economic people. And actually, this became the kind of Delta thinking, which we call in the Netherlands. And now, if there's a big plan on transportation, for example, we call it the Delta Plan for Transportation, or the Delta Plan for Health, which means that people get together, do some, discuss the content, and then try to make decisions. So from the actual water part, it's now everywhere. It's like a virus. I will give you a little bit of context where I come from. So this is for me, this is a kind of archetypical Dutch situation. This is the environment we live in. And if you look at the delta and your delta and our delta, there are some similarities and there's some big differences, of course. I always like to point out that, in fact, for us, it's relatively easy to take decisions and to get together and to spend money, because many of our people, much of our economy is in the floodplain. Where did it go? What's happening? So much of our economy, about 65% of our economy is in the floodplain. Actually, flood management is not a political topic. There's decisions taken in Parliament, but it's not that it's balanced against transportation or health. So I like to paint that context. In effect, it's a bit similar than your situation. Well, America is a very different country in culture, where the delta is so important in California. It in fact affects everybody. So you would think it's not a political issue. It's normal that you take measures there to solve the problems. But I think the variety of issues that you have to deal with may be bigger. And in that context of, let's say, quite some room to do water management, our institute is present. So we focus on all kinds of water-related aspects: groundwater, rivers, coasts. It's policy. It's to a degree design, and there's a lot of modeling and the use of modeling in decision-making processes. And I will show you two examples. So why did I end up here, or why did we end up here? And there's two examples very close to your environment. One is that for a long time we have been working with the USGS. We have, I think it's about 15 years at the moment, maybe 10, 15 years. At least one person of us has been sitting in the office of the USGS, working on modeling, introducing our, these days, open source Delft 3D system. In fact, not that important, but to transfer the code. We develop code for water management, to support water management decisions, but also to support people using it and developing models to a degree, because this is an independent thing. In itself, Delft 3D you could call a system with which you could do integrated environmental modeling. But like has been said before many times, it's not only about the model. You can do it, but there's much more to it. And for example, we have been supporting the USGS also with the Cascade project, which I think will be discussed in the afternoon. So I will not talk very much about this at this stage. It's an open source system. And the other thing we did in this environment is we've been involved in the developing of the new river forecasting system. Maybe Rob Hartman will talk about it a little bit later on. And that uses Delfuse software, which is, you can say, like a process manager. So it's an IT tool which structures working processes. How do you get from data to forecasts? And that's what I find interesting about software and about, let's say, especially when you try to take into decision in real time, that is relatively obvious that you have to, in the end, say whether there's a flood or not. You have to really be specific about how you're going to use the data, how you're going to validate it, how are you going to run the models. Because it's software, you have to be specific. And it forces people somehow to take decisions and to connect. So it's not the goal in itself, but it can help let's say, an organizational transition process in an organization, and to a degree also over various organizations, to rationalize that, to harmonize it. It won't solve the problem, but it helps to bring people on the same page for certain aspects. Okay, that's my introduction, and I will stay in the time. I want to talk to you about two cases, and these are Dutch cases. One is about international estuary management in the Western Scheldt. I will show you where it is in a minute, and then I will talk a bit about the National Water Management Plan in the Netherlands, which is called the Delta program, Delta again. But before I do that, I want to talk a bit about, what are we talking about? If we talk about community modeling, for example, in fact, for me, it's of course knowledge management. You bring together knowledge and you somehow try to let's say, understand what the system is doing, what are views of scientists on the system. It's the kind of objective information that you have about the system. And compared to politics or that's more, well, there's something at stake. It may be more subjective. And for me, modeling of, let's say, this environment is about data. It's about how do you look at the system? What are the important functions you try to address? And what are the indicators? How are you going to look at them? And then, of course, you have to somehow model them. Of course, it's normally in the other way around, in practical sense. But in fact, that may be the right order. And then you have to, well, exchange information between peer groups, between groups with different backgrounds, scientists, but also to the outside world. So it has been said several times before. And of course, you need some software to, well, hang it all together. And in the end, the goal is to derive policies and measures that are accepted, so can be implemented. Well, that sounds good, but how to do it? I'm not going to give you an answer. I'll just give you a picture of two processes that worked in that way. So first is the Western Scheldt, which is the estuary. You see it there. The white part is in the picture on the right is Holland, and below it is Belgium. So it's an international context. And here you see it also, the harbor of Rotterdam and the harbor of Antwerp, which are both very big harbors in Europe and competing, are in that area. And the Western Scheldt is the shipping channel to Antwerp. It's about 60 miles, and it's going through quite a natural area. It's one of we've closed off everything in Holland. This is the only one we didn't close, because the Belgians didn't want us to close it. We closed it several hundred years ago for some time. And the context is if you look at society, the context is also this, that the 1953 flood in Holland changed the thinking about flood management very much. People in that area, the farmers, the population, they don't want to retreat. They don't want to give anything back to the water. Their grandparents have been in this flood, and even if they didn't, it's very much protecting in that area. And then there's the harbor of Antwerp. It's very big. It's getting bigger all the time, and the ships have to come in. And then there's of course the environment, because it's a protected area. And but that is that's most difficult to quantify. The other two are very much quantifiable. Civil engineers can do that, but the rest is like me. But the other aspect, environment, is also very important. Now, one of the let's say the things that one was the long-term vision development. How should you develop that area, which is let's say triggered by the deepening. The deepening is the driving factor for the discussions. I should say, I said the Belgians, I maybe jokingly said, we have closed the harbor. We have actually in 1585, we've closed their harbor for 200 years. And you would think that's a long time ago, but it's still in the cultural memory. And if we restrict, let's say, the dredging, it comes up again. Okay, so the long-term vision, and there's many rounds. I will just show you one. The second round of discussions about the deepening was at the end of the 90s. It took about 25 years to come to a decision. It started off with political discussions, and of course there were scientists involved, and at a certain point. But it took a very long time. And then in 2005, there was another round, and knowing it's not so long after the first one. So in that case, what actually happened was that the scientists and the engineers from both countries started to work together first, and they started to think about what is the morphology of the estuary, how does it affect the ecology, doing some modeling, not necessarily one model, but do it side by side, but do it as a team. So more or less, let's say, agree with the different scientists in both countries about what is the right thing to do. And then it went actually very smooth in this political project. But that is a long-term vision, and in 5 years' time, there's more elements into it, but the deepening would be to 45 feet, and there would be 3,000 hectares of land be given back to the estuary to compensate some of the deepening effects for nature, especially. Okay, that's good. I will do this example, and maybe I'll skip the other one. And then, of course, it comes to implementation. And then you're back on the ground, because here we talk about this big estuary, but then an individual polder, they have to take away the levees. And this area is called the Hedwiegespolder, which is very close to nuclear plants and also to a natural area, and only a few people live there. But then again, implementation becomes a political problem. And what can models do there? Actually, very little. But it's an important step. You make a plan, you want to implement it. So it's very political. The parliament in Holland said, well, we're not going to give up the land for the Belgians, for the deepening of the river. In fact, the discussion was very much about, in the end, you had a context that there was this long-term vision. In that context, something had to happen. So in the end, there was, of course, a relatively legal discussion about what are the indicators. Are the indicators actually, let's say, proving an advantage or not? So it was a semi-legal discussion. In the end, it went through, but it took 8 years to get through. But it's important that to be specific about why is a plan actually giving an advantage. Why is an alternative measure not better? Because our goal is, in fact, to have these visions implemented. Okay, I will skip this one, and I will go to the last one. Yeah. So I want to return back to. This slide, and I modified it a little bit. So we have been talking about this objective information, and about before talking about building communities or building communities for modeling. And I'm not saying that this is truth, but I would think that if you look at this process, and also as a national water plan in the Netherlands, and I think it must be similar in your environment, there are a number of aspects where you should reach uniformity in this whole modeling context, which is about the data, for example, the depths, the habitats. That should be objective and agreed within a community. Also about the functions and indicators. If you think about a plan, then you need to know what's it for? How are you going to look at information? And be very specific. This is really something that should be developed in a community. And also the information management. How are you going to communicate? How are you going to do that? And how are you going to keep everybody on the same page and understand what's actually the decision and what are the consequences? I think here you talk about uniformity. You have to agree about that too, largely. And variety, actually it doesn't matter exactly which models you use. It will be helpful, and maybe you win a prize if you do it right. But if it's not easy, you can also use models side by side. Even for ecology, for example, I think it's very, very good to use models side by side because they reflect visions on how an ecological system is developing. But you need to be clear how you use them. How you use them side by side. The information management needs to be clear. And software is not that important. It's practical, maybe it saves money, but... So there's a variety and there's uniformity. But the most important thing, I think, if you think about the community is, and it's again a repetition, but it's organization. Because you can think about the community, but so you can get together and exchange information. And but in the end, you want to make it productive. You want to get something out of it. And that means that, it was talking about scale and complexity. I think the organization struggles with that. If you have a community and you organize a community, there should be purpose and there should be continuity in it. It shouldn't be too big. It shouldn't be too, let's say, inhomogeneous. There should be clear focus in it. And also it should be somehow create a trust between the organization. But without the organization, without having an enthusiastic, dynamic community which is not encompassing everybody, because that's not possible, things won't happen in the end. I mean, good discussions, but it doesn't contribute effectively to decision making. I almost sound like a preacher, I'm sorry. And this is my last slide. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's follow up with questions over lunch. Next speaker is Richard Howitt. We're going to try to get you to lunch just as fast as we can.
Thank you, Jay. I have to confess to being both a modeler and an economist, so put up with me. Also, I'm going to talk about linking economics and hydrologic models. I'm going to use a very narrow but I think pertinent case, which is the future and I think perhaps the biggest shift in California water policy, the SGMA Groundwater Management Act. And Jay will disapprove because I don't have any insights, but I do have numbers. On the other hand, Gary would appreciate it because he says, answer the question. And Peter told us that we have to have co-equal goals, so this is the money goal and the water supply one. And this is done jointly with my colleagues, Duncan McEwen and then Steve Hatchett later. Estuarine systems, by definition of the interface between freshwater and saltwater, at least according to my thinking, and therefore the freshwater flows determine, and the rate of those flows determine the state of the estuary, and the freshwater flows are influenced by human use of water. This is driven by economic and environmental goals. We are the big predator. And it's subject, of course, to geologic and hydrologic constraints. And so omitting either of these components for policy results in errors. And you get feedbacks in both directions. For instance, with groundwater, which I'm going to talk about, because it's part of our California water supply, a critical part, you get overpumping in the lack of bad economic criteria, which is what we have currently. On the other hand, as we'll see, that if you regulate that, that will change both the quantity and the value of water available in different parts of California. And this will affect the estuarine flows, particularly through the delta. I want to go to a point that Will brought up earlier on, and that's the point of scale, because an integrating model is really scaled, and it really hits things very toughly when it comes to trying to put economics in, because particularly agricultural economics, you tend to grow one, at the most, 2 crops a year, and so you're very lucky if you've got monthly demands for water. And yet, we're trying to interface these with hydrologic or groundwater models that run perhaps on a daily basis or weekly. And so we have to, or maybe even hourly in my slides, we have to aggregate up very coarsely, and you can see the wince going across the face of my hydrologic colleagues when you say, come on, throw all these daily observations together and give me a monthly mean. You know. On the other hand, spatial resolution is also a problem. That hydrology, of course, we have our nodes, and yet in economics, we often ignore spatial resolution, which is a really bad idea when we're getting economic results from physical inputs. So we have to be aware that these aggregation, disaggregation errors are nonlinear, and of course the aggregation errors are much easier to aggregate than disaggregate, since disaggregation requires additional information. And in this particular example, we're aggregating the groundwater models to a monthly basis, and we're disaggregating the economic agricultural models also to a monthly basis based on crop water requirements. Likewise, we're taking aggregate hydrologic results, and these current ones I'm going to show you in a minute are not based on groundwater basins. They're based on what we call agronomic units, which are institutional units, and there's 27 of them in the Central Valley. But they do overlie, to a greater or lesser extent, groundwater basins. And so we have to try and have these models talk to each other through a process of aggregation and disaggregation, since the feedback go in both directions. So what's happening in California? This year, we had a really remarkable thing happen. We caught up with the rest of the world and the rest of the country. We're high-tech here. By putting forth some groundwater management legislation. Up until then, and as we speak right now, our groundwater is, with a few rare exceptional examples, completely unmanaged, and people pump whatever they want to pump. I know this. I have my own wells, and I pump what I want. And by the way, my well information is secret. You can't have it. Why? I have no idea. I had to file it with the county, and they're not allowed to tell you what's going on. With the comparison with Rob's Australian data set, it was just extraordinary. And I was reminded the other day how well the Australians have run the drought. I'm a little bit biased there. But compared with California, which is currently running its drought through 2 things. One is groundwater, and one is water markets. And guess what? There's no information on either. We don't know what's going on with groundwater, and we don't know what's going on with water markets. It's truly amazing. Okay, moving on. Let's look at this thing of Sigma. I'm writing a paper with a couple of colleagues, Duncan McEwen and Steve Hatchett. And fundamentally, we are trying to find out, answer the question, as Gary would tell us we have to do, is what is going to be the impact and the cost of this Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which in theory doesn't come in till 2042, but in fact I hope will come in significantly before that. And so we're linking two groundwater models with an economic model. And we have spatial aggregation to these production regions, and we have time aggregation, and we're consolidating daily simulations into monthly growing season units. Now, we are taking the worst possible case for Sigma, and this is, these are the basins in California and the CASGEM, and these are listed as high, medium, low, or very low priority. And it's quite clear to see, I'll see if I can press the right button on this pointer, that these ones here in the Central Valley are the ones where we are most at risk. So these are the high basins. We have a few down here in Southern California. What we're going to do with these, we did with these basins is, first of all, we took the hydrologic models, aggregated them, looked at the balance. We said, let's take the worst possible case for the valley. No new water supplies and surface water. The worst possible case. How do you bring a basin into balance if you've got overdraft? You have to reduce evapotranspiration. No ifs, buts, or ands. It's a very simple equation. And so you have to take agricultural irrigated land out of production. That's it. How much will have to come, and how much will it cost? Here's a set of 27 regions in the valley, and I've given them the general. These are Sacramento Valley regions. This is the Delta, and this is San Joaquin Valley, and these are Tulare Basin. Now, this is the percentage of the groundwater pumping that took place between 2000 and 2009 in each of these regions that can continue if the basin is in steady state over a 10-year average interval with 2000 to 2009 pumping rates. So for instance, this basin in the central Sacramento Valley can get by with about an 8% cut in groundwater. This basin in the upper end of the San Joaquin Valley has to take a 60% cut. This basin in the Tulare has to take a 90% cut in their groundwater. And so this is the first time this data has come out that I'm aware, because nobody has wanted to grasp the tough problem. How much are you going to cut, who's cutting, and where? And here it is. It could be wrong, it's very aggregate, it's based on 2000 to 2009, but it is based on both the DWR C2V SIM model and the CVH model from the USGS. So, and in a nutshell, we see that about 45% of the basins have to cut 10 to 15%. Another 45% have to cut about 40%. And there's 3 or 4 basins, and we can see them right here, and I've deliberately taken the names off because I don't want to scare people, where they're going to have to make really incredibly stringent cuts in their groundwater use to reach a steady state without additional surface supplies. This is the driver. Put this into the economic model and we get the money. So this is answering the question, well, okay, what's it going to do to water values? In the upper Sacramento Valley, no change. As we get down into this area here in the lower Sacramento Valley, water values, the imputed value of water is going to jump from in the $50 to $70 range, and it's going to double. The delta is relatively unaffected, no change in the delta values. As we move into San Joaquin, we start to see these enormous increases in value. And so this region here, which has been managing its water on a $100 an acre foot basis, is going to be facing $380 to $400. This is 2030 levels of development, by the way. As we get to the Tulare Basin, we see a really remarkable increase in value. What's this going to do with the delta? This means that the money gradient across the delta in water value, which is somewhere in the region of about $400 at the minute, is going to jump to about $500 to $600. That the gradient of pressure to move water across the delta is going to increase. The opportunity cost of water below the delta is going to increase. And so this concept should have really significant effects on both infrastructure, delta management, and where do we invest. But the economics is interesting because if you look at the groundwater cuts, and the green is Tulare and the blue is San Joaquin, we see similar average, about 28% cut in groundwater. But you only see a significant acreage cut in the Tulare Basin, about 8%. And then the revenues, because the farmers are adjusting on all these ways and they're taking out the high water using low water value crops and they're changing their technologies. The actual economic burden looks manageable. Certainly in the Sacramento and San Joaquin, not a problem. In Tulare, we've got to eat several $100 million. But I would emphasize that our initial analysis, which I am not showing, shows that in the long run, you'll have about a 15-year loss of revenue. And then after that, your positive revenue for the infinite future with a stable, long-term sustainable basin that allows you to develop high-value crops. Here's some details here that we're losing about 1.3 million acre-feet per year average groundwater pumping to stabilize these basins. We are going to lose about 330,000 acres per year of evapotranspiration. Does that mean we're going to have vast dust bowls? No. What we're going to do is we're going to have a shift back towards the greater use of fallowing as an agronomic rotation and weed control and salinity control and nitrogen control. There will be some positive effects as well as negative effects. And it'll cost us somewhere in the region of $320 million in terms of lost revenue. We will save several $100 million of pumping costs and well replacement capacity costs. So in a nutshell, the take-home message, as I see it, is that estuarine and water supply policies are intertwined, and anyone who's been working the Delta will know that. We assume that Sigma can stabilize groundwater, has to stabilize by 2030, not 2042. The costs of this vary tremendously throughout the valley, and the increasing water value will make the north-south differences in terms of both water and economic gradients greater. And this means that integrated water management decisions will need to be reconsidered under Sigma, because the scarcity and the availability of water is going to change quite substantially. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. That's we now are integrating across the entire span from meteorology to economics, and now we're going to have more. But you want this the other way. Yeah, let me,
Okay, Thank you. My name is Kieran Harmon. I'm an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University. I want to talk, the talk I want to give today is a little, I guess, more narrowly focused in some ways than the very stimulating talks we've heard earlier in this session. But there is a general point to it that I think echoes what we just heard and also what Jay said in the previous session, in that when we're integrating models together, and each has its own interesting disciplinary questions associated with it, there are interesting fundamental questions and fundamental problems that must be solved at the interface between those models. And then, in fact, fundamental advances in theory and in the mathematical modeling at the interfaces can be very stimulating and very interesting. So what I want to talk about today is a piece of a water sustainability and climate project based at Johns Hopkins, but which has a large number of collaborators across many institutions that is focused very much on the Chesapeake Bay, and in particular on understanding how climate change will affect through all the coupled systems of the Chesapeake Bay, from the, where's that pointer gone? From how farmers make decisions about when to plant crops, what crops to plant, and how much fertilizer to apply and when to apply it, how those changes coupled to concurrent changes in climate will affect watershed processes, and how those those changes will then propagate into the bay. And we're particularly interested in sort of intra-annual, sort of seasonal variability and the timing of events, the timing of the onset of eutrophication events, and long-term behaviour, and then how these things connect to policy scenarios. We have a lot of interaction through this project with government agencies that are very embedded in the Bay, and in particular, in the work that I do, thinking about the watershed piece of this, interacting with the Chesapeake Bay Program, which is a partnership of many agencies and institutions. One of the main roles of the partnership of this program is to construct and run the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Model, which is a model that tries to predict and route water and nutrients through the entire Chesapeake Bay watersheds into the bay, predicting the timing of nutrient, sediment, and water exports. That model is embedded in legislation, and it is used to perform various legislative goals, including setting TMDL diets for the watersheds. It's a very sort of typical lumped watershed model, a prototypical watershed model based on HSPF. Each of the 1,000+ sub-watersheds of the model has embedded within it a lumped hydrologic model that has these compartments, these sort of upper soil zone, groundwater zone, each of which has water and nutrients routed through it, and has parameters that must be calibrated associated with that. The program has oversight or received recommendations from scientific and technical advisory committees that push it in different directions about what kind of things ought to be included in the model and how it should be developed further. One of the very important things that Scientific Advisory Council has said is a crucial advance that's required is to incorporate the effects of groundwater lags and groundwater lag times in this model. In the Chesapeake Bay watersheds, about half the water that enters the watersheds is essentially groundwater. It's base flow. It spent some period of time in the groundwater, and that water contributes about half of the nitrate that ends up in the stream. And that water, much of it is very, very old. Half the water in the Delmarva Peninsula, for instance, is more than 13 years old by the time it reaches the bay. So that has enormous implications for our ability to think about what will be the effect of a particular management action on the future inputs into the bay. I mean, if we take some action now, it may be decades before we see a significant reduction in the amount of nitrate reaching the bay. So a question is, how do we incorporate that? How do we incorporate this long lag times into the model in a way that is both physically justified, but also doesn't require us to rewrite the model from scratch, since this is a huge model that has had input from many, many stakeholders, and it would be infeasible to try to reconstruct it from scratch. There are other models that are looking at these groundwater lag times in a lot of detail. For instance, people at the USGS, particularly Ward Stanford and some colleagues, have been putting together these very detailed mod flow simulations of groundwater transport through pieces of the watershed. They've conducted this on the Delmarva Peninsula, on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay, and are currently working on the Potomac River Basin and intend to continue to expand this work. This modelling involves, a gridded groundwater transport model, flow and transport model, transport being conducted with particle tracking through the groundwater flow domain at steady state. So this is a steady state groundwater flow model. And you can see that it provides information about how long it takes some recharge that enters the domain at a particular point to enter a stream and eventually into the bay. And you can see that those ages range on the order from 0 to 300 years at the top end there. So, question, how can we take this kind of steady state groundwater model in a gridded domain and plug that into a lumped sub-watershed based daily time step watershed model? How do we make that link? So a useful tool that we could use to do this is the idea of a transit time distribution, which is a distribution of the ages of water leaving a system. Now, to give you a little more detail on that, imagine we have some control volume. It might be a sub-watershed, for instance. And within that system, we have parcels of water, each of which has a different age attached to it. And so we can think about the residence time distribution within the system. The inflow entering the system has initially age 0, and after it enters, it displaces some water that is already present, and so we have water leaving that has its own distribution of ages. So that's our outflow transit time distribution. And these transit time distributions are very useful for predicting solute transport if the flow is steady state. So for instance, if we have some age distribution or transit time distribution based on either numerical modelling or some fitted relationship, we can convolve that with some scenario of inputs to the system through a simple convolution to get a time series of outputs from the system. Basically, at each time step, mixing the historical inputs to the system in the past according to that transit time distribution. This is an approach that works very well in groundwater systems, but only in steady flow. In non-steady flows, this simple approach will not work. It won't conserve mass. And I could tell you more about that, but I'm cutting down my time here. There's many sources of time variability in transit time distributions. It's not just the flow. We also have to think about the time variability of the inputs, but also the time variability of the outputs, both of which are driven by the hydrologic system. But there's also changes in the hydrologic pathways in the system over short term and over the long term due to things like land use change. And so ideally, what we would like is some lumped representation of all these things that we can use to incorporate things like land use change and climate change eventually. This is sort of being the big picture. As a step towards that big picture, there is now, based on research from groups in Italy and work that we've been doing at Hopkins, what I would say is a rigorous and convenient theoretical framework that generalizes the idea of a transit time distribution to fully time variable flows and non-stationary transport conditions. It's called the SAS theory, storage selection functions. A storage selection function being the thing you parameterize instead of a transit time distribution. And there's a few flavors of these. The one I want to talk about is based on some work I recently completed and is published in Water Resources Research. And just to give you a taste of what this theory looks like, imagine you take your control system, it has some inputs, such as rainfall or recharge, it has some outputs, such as discharge, and evapotranspiration. And we can define a new variable, which we call the age rank storage, being the volume of water inside the system that that is less than a certain age at a certain time. So right now, inside your watershed, how much water is less than a week old? How much water is less than a month old? This is a variable that we can track in time. Yes. And so imagine when we sort of visualize what we do with that is to say, let's take all the water in your system and arrange it in a vertical column with the youngest water at the top of the column and the oldest water further down. And so when there's precipitation or recharge coming into the system, it's maybe variable in time, that's always going to be entering at the top of the column since it has age 0. The discharge, however, can have a distribution of ages. So you imagine this column has a series of valves coming out the side. If we can describe a distribution of how much water, relatively speaking, is taken from each one of those valves, that defines a sort of a mixing rule that we can then use to determine as a function of time and as a function of what that distribution of ages are in storage, what the transit time distribution therefore looks like and how it varies in time. So, so the shape of this, and I should mention, this function that describes that distribution of how much water, relatively speaking, is taken from each one of these valves is this storage selection function. So that's the thing that we now have to parameterize instead of the transit time distribution. It's a probability distribution of storages, not a probability distribution of times. The shape of that distribution determines the nature of transport in the system. So if we have a uniform distribution, we are taking water in an unbiased way from what's inside the system, that corresponds to a well-mixed sort of system. So well-mixed gives you, at steady state, an exponential transit time distribution, but it gives you a uniform RSAS function. So these are different from each other. So just quickly, in the paper we describe the application to a very well-monitored stream in Wales, where they have this extraordinary data set of 30 years of weekly rainfall and weekly streamflow chloride, and there's no anthropogenic or geogenic sources of chloride in the system, so we can use this as as good as we can get of a conservative tracer. And by calibrating only 3 parameters for this shape of this distribution and how it varies as a function of catchment wetness, we're able to match in a pretty good way the time series of streamflow chloride purely from the rainfall chloride and the hydrologic balance from timescales of days to decades. So if we look at it in a frequency domain, we actually match the behavior all across the frequency spectrum. So how do we apply that in the Chesapeake Bay? So the idea is therefore to take the output from this ModFlow, ModPath model of, say, the Delmarva Peninsula, and for each one of the model, the watershed model sub-watersheds, determine what is the transit time distribution from each of the grid cells in there to the nearest stream. And so we can actually get that transit time distribution. And then under the assumption of the steady state flow, we can convert that into an equivalent RSAS function. So this is the equivalent storage selection function that at steady flow would give you that transit time distribution. And then we make the assumption that even though recharge is varying in time, the RSAS function doesn't vary nearly as much. So you can have, if your system is well mixed, it's still well mixed. So then we can parameterize the shape of that RSAS function and then use that with the time variable recharge that comes out of the watershed model and the time variable concentrations that come out of that watershed model to route that through each one of the sub-watersheds to produce the stream nitrate concentrations. So we've been doing this now. This is what the RSAS functions look like for all of these, I think, 262 sub-watersheds in the Delmarva Peninsula. They give us a distribution of sort of means of those distributions. So these are sort of a mean depth of storage that's participating in transport, and they're sort of on the order of hundreds of inches, which is about what we would expect. And they also correspond spatially with sort of the distribution of geologic structures inside the peninsula. You can sort of see patterns there. Just to give you a quick example, one little watershed up on the coastal side of the Delmarva might have a certain recharge flux coming out of the soil zone and into the groundwater. You can see that on the top there. Very variable in time. It has a base flow flux coming out that varies more on a seasonal timescale. And we can route different scenarios of nutrients moving into that system and out again. So the blue here being steady recharge, a steady concentration of annual sort of pulse inputs. And if we had a step change of a reduction of 75% in the red there, you can see how long that step change takes in the order of, so I think that happened in about 1989. This is just a purely hypothetical scenario. You haven't even seen probably half of the ultimate change that you would get by the time you get to this year. So the conclusion really is just that this is an example of where a fundamental theoretical advance was needed to provide a bridge between models operating at different scales, in this case different spatial scales and different temporal scales. The theoretical advance in this case was this idea of a storage selection function, which generalizes the idea of a transit time distribution. And this was able to bridge models between distributed groundwater and lumped catchment modeling. So, yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Oh, yeah, you want that back. So I guess we should be ready for lunch. What time did we want everyone to be back from lunch? That's the most important question before you release people for lunch, is what time do you want them back? 12:40. Okay. Go forth and have lunch and talk to the speakers and each other. Thank you all to the speakers. That's really nice.